Elise, with whom I had lived for 9 years, and I were reading the news on our tablets after finishing our Saturday morning breakfast when the doorbell rang. Elise jumped slightly in surprise. I had noticed that she had been a bit nervous and restless over the past week or so, and her anxiety had led to some very good intimacy between us, much better than the boring, uninspired intimacy we'd had for the previous 6 months. "I'll get it," I said, placing my iPad on the table and heading to the door. When I opened it, I saw 2 men showing badges that identified them as police officers. "Good morning. How can I help you?" I asked. "Are you Mr. Brian Campbell?" asked the larger one. I nodded. "We're Officers Stevens and Peters from the Austin Police Department, sir. We are here to execute a search warrant," he said, handing me a packet of documents. "A search warrant?" I exclaimed in confusion. "For what?" "Sir, everything is described in the warrant. We'll give you a few minutes to read it. You can also contact your lawyer if you feel it's necessary. We'd also like to speak with your wife, Elise Campbell, if she's available." "She's in the kitchen," I said, leading the 2 officers into the hallway. I read through the warrant and discovered that it was indeed issued for my wife, Elise, specifically regarding any firearms she might possess and any property that might belong to a Mr. Conrad O'Brien. Returning to the kitchen with the police officers, I asked, "Is this somehow related to that rich guy who was found dead last week? My wife works for one of his companies, but we don't know him. I've never even met the guy." As I said this, I looked up and saw that my wife's face had turned pale, and her eyes were wide with shock. If they were looking for a guilty face, they didn't need to look any further. "Elise, do you know what this is about?" "They have a warrant to search our house, and it implies that you're somehow connected to Conrad O'Brien's murder," I said, irritation creeping into my voice. "Sir, please allow us to ask the questions. Could you sit somewhere outside of the kitchen?" "We have a few questions we'd like to ask Mrs. Campbell," one of the officers said. "Is she under arrest?" I asked. I really think she should speak to a lawyer before answering a bunch of questions. "Elise, do you want me to call my lawyer and see if he can find someone to represent you?" "Yes, please," Elise said quietly, tears beginning to well up in the corners of her eyes. "That's certainly her right," one of the police officers said. "Why don't we schedule an interview for next week? Right now, we're just gathering evidence, and no one is under arrest. In fact, we'd also like to have a conversation with you, Mr. Campbell. We can do that at the station at the same time as your wife's interview. Of course, you have the right to legal representation during the interview if you wish. One more question, sir. Do you have any firearms in the house that we should be aware of?" "First of all, I'm happy to talk to you here, not at the station. I've never met O'Brien, and I have nothing to hide. Secondly, yes, I have a few pistols, all of which are locked in my gun safe, except for one in the drawer of my bedside table. Could Officer Peters accompany you to retrieve the pistol from the bedside table, and then could you open your gun safe so we can take a look?" Understanding that I didn't have much of a choice and wanting to appear cooperative, I replied, "Of course, follow me. It's right this way," and led Officer Peters to the master bedroom. Once there, I pointed to my bedside table. "It's in the top drawer." Wearing gloves, Officer Peters opened the drawer and carefully removed my tourist judge, using an evidence collection rod, and placed the pistol in a collection bag. "Your gun safe?" "Certainly. This way," I said, leading him to my office. Once inside, I entered the combination and opened the large, heavy door of the gun safe. "Sir, we're going to take all firearms to our lab for testing. Before we leave, we'll issue you a receipt for the items we confiscate. Once everything has been checked, your property will be returned." "All right," I said, realizing I had no other option. Peters spoke into a small microphone. "Michaels, I need you and your team to come here and start inventorying the owner's firearms." "Got it, boss. Be right there," I heard a voice respond from the speaker. Moments later, Michaels and his team were in my office with containers and bags, ready to inventory and collect the weapons. I glanced at Peters, who nodded and then cleared his throat. "All right, guys, we're here to search the premises for any items listed in the warrant. Specifically, we're looking for any additional firearms. Michaels will assign each of you a search area. Let's get to work." Over the next few hours, the team dispersed and thoroughly searched our house and the 2 cars we had parked in the garage. While they weren't destructive, the house was certainly in disarray by the time the search was complete. We waited about 10 minutes while the forensic team and the 2 officers conferred near their cars. I kept looking at Elise, giving her my best, "What the hell is going on? Look." Then Officer Peters knocked on the door. I opened it, and he handed me a receipt, thanking me for cooperating with the search. As if I had a choice. I nodded, glancing over the receipt and noting that all they had taken were firearms, 5 long rifles and 4 pistols. He asked if he could speak with Mrs. Campbell, and I once again led him into our home. Elise was still sitting at the kitchen table, her head down, and it looked like she had been crying. The officer gently asked, "Mrs. Campbell?" She looked up, and he handed her a copy of his business card, instructing her to arrange an interview at the station later in the week, once her lawyer was available. She nodded and said, "All right." Then he asked if he and his partner could have a conversation with me in my office and informed me that I had the right to an attorney if I wanted one. I said I didn't need one since I'd never met O'Brien and had nothing to hide. The interview was thorough, but lasted less than an hour, as I had never even met O'Brien. They wanted to know if I had any grievances against this fool who apparently had been sleeping with my wife, and they also wanted to check my alibi. They asked about my whereabouts on the night O'Brien was killed. I asked which night it was, and they gave me the date. I pulled out my iPhone and looked at my calendar. I was at my friend Lee Rogers' house that night. Elise told me she was going to stay over at her aunt's in Fredericksburg, so I called Lee, and he invited me over. I explained. When they asked what we did, I said we had dinner with Lee's wife, Pat. After dinner, we chatted for a bit, and then Lee took me up in his private plane since he's an avid pilot. I explained that in his neighborhood, at Breakaway Park in Cedar Park, there's a private airstrip, and many of the residents, including Lee, have their own planes and hangars. It turned out the officers were familiar with the area. I told them we took off around 8 p.m. and returned about an hour later. They asked who piloted the plane, and I said that I wasn't the pilot, but Lee had served as a military pilot for many years, so I felt perfectly safe flying with him. They mentioned they might need to verify my story, so I gave them Lee's full name, address, and phone number. Later, I talked to Lee and learned that the police had interviewed both him and Pat at their home, and they both confirmed my story. They also provided the police with surveillance footage they got from their HOA. The footage was from a camera aimed at the airstrip, showing planes taking off and landing. The video confirmed that Lee's plane took off at 8:05 p.m. and returned at 9:15 p.m. The police thanked me for my cooperation and left. I returned to the kitchen and spoke to my wife. "What the hell does all this mean? You work at one of his companies, but I never thought you had anything to do with that scumbag O'Brien. What the hell is going on, Elise? Were you having an affair with that idiot?" She looked up at me, her lower lip trembling, tears streaming down her face. She whimpered, "I'm so sorry," then jumped up from her seat and rushed to our bedroom, locking the door behind her. The following week was chaotic. Local news channels got wind of the search warrant and hounded both Elise and me for interviews or comments. Conrad O'Brien's murder was the top local story. We didn't say anything, just as her lawyer had instructed. My attorney referred Elise to Ted Walker, a local criminal defense lawyer. For some reason, Elise didn't want me present at the meeting she scheduled with Ted for Monday afternoon. Something was definitely wrong. O'Brien had made millions developing software and online projects. His companies had once employed over 1,000 people locally, but a few years ago, he outsourced most of his development work to India to cut costs. Nonetheless, he frequently made headlines, often for charitable donations, and he still employed quite a few people, including Elise. However, there were rumors that old Conrad was a womanizer, particularly fond of betting attractive married women. Walker arranged for Elise to meet with the police at 9:30 a.m. on Friday. She told me that Ted believed the police were just fishing for information and doubted anything substantial would come of it. Well, Ted couldn't have been more wrong. Around 11:30 a.m. on Friday, I received a call from a distraught Elise, informing me that after the interview, the police had arrested her and charged her with the murder of Conrad O'Brien. She was taken into custody and placed in the women's jail downtown, with a bail hearing set for the following Monday. I asked if I could attend the bail hearing, but I was told it was closed to the public. Late Monday evening, Elise called me, and it sounded like she had been crying. She said her bail had been set at $500,000 and asked if I could post it for her. Since I had never been involved with the criminal justice system before, I Googled bail and found out that a bail bondsman typically charges a non-refundable fee of 10% of the bail amount. Damn, that's $50,000 we'd never get back. A few years ago, I had started a successful recruiting business, and we were doing well financially. But still, $50,000 was a lot of money. I told her that before I handed over that kind of cash, I wanted to meet with her, and she needed to be completely honest with me about what was going on. She agreed. I suppose she didn't have much choice if she wanted my cooperation. Walker set up a meeting for us in the jail's interrogation room and said he'd be there to explain everything. I arrived at the jail, where they checked me to make sure I wasn't carrying any contraband or weapons, and then I was led to the interrogation room usually used by defendants and their attorneys. Walker and Elise were already in the room, and Elise was wearing an orange jumpsuit. It didn't look good on her at all. Instead of getting answers directly from Elise, Walker acted as her spokesperson. He said that I would likely find out the facts anyway, so he was prepared to tell me what I wanted to know. He revealed that Elise and O'Brien had been having an affair for about 6 months, which had only ended because of his death. I was stunned by this revelation and glared at Elise angrily. "You're a damn cheat. No wonder sex with you was so damn boring until that jerk died. He was using you, wasn't he, you liar?" Elise sat there shocked and devastated by my outburst, her head bowed, crying. Walker said he understood how upsetting this news was for me and asked if I could take a few minutes to calm down. He said that despite the affair, he was certain Elise didn't kill O'Brien. "Really?" I asked. "If you're so damn sure, then why did they arrest her for his murder?" "They must have some pretty solid evidence against her." Walker went on to explain that the murder took place at O'Brien's 300-hectare ranch, located in the Texas Hill Country, west of Austin. The house on the ranch was a mini-mansion, smaller than O'Brien's luxurious home on Lake Austin, but still a 2-story, 450-square-meter residence with a pool and tennis court. The house was equipped with exterior security cameras, with night vision that captured any vehicle or pedestrian movement approaching the home from all sides. There were also interior cameras, but O'Brien only activated them when he was away. And indeed, these cameras were turned off when he was killed. Ted continued, explaining that the police had shown footage from the surveillance cameras, which captured O'Brien's Lamborghini driving up the driveway at 9 p.m. on the night he was murdered. The camera inside the house clearly recorded him entering the garage before he turned off the interior cameras. Around 10 p.m., the exterior surveillance cameras captured Elise's Lexus driving up the driveway and parking outside. The footage clearly shows Elise walking up to the front door and entering the house. I found the casual way she walked in just as unsettling as the rest of this messy situation. A few minutes later, the same camera recorded her hastily leaving the house and practically running to her car before quickly driving away. "Damn," I exclaimed. "It sure as hell looks like she did it." I looked at Elise and asked, "Did you really do it?" Her lawyer tried to stop her from answering, but she didn't listen to his advice. "No, I swear, I didn't do it. When I went inside, I saw him sitting in his chair. I could see his legs, but his back was to me. He didn't respond when I called out, so I thought he was asleep. When I walked around the chair and looked at him, he had a bullet hole in his forehead, right between his eyes, and his chest was covered in blood. I screamed, panicked, and ran back to my car. "I'm not sure why I should believe you," I said. "You've already admitted that you're a lying, deceitful crap who had an affair behind my back for 6 months while I was working hard to give you the kind of life most women would dream of. And I'm also not sure why I should fork over $50,000 to bail you out of this place." Walker tried to bring some much-needed calm and logic to the conversation. He explained that since we were in a community property state, half of our money belonged to Elise, and they could get those $50,000 with or without my help. In the end, I gave in and agreed to cooperate, but I made it clear to Elise that regardless of my cooperation, we were done. Walker remained optimistic that Elise could avoid charges, despite the fact that she had been at O'Brien's house and fled the scene without calling the police. Walker summarized the evidence gathered by the police. "The good news is that the ballistic analysis didn't match any of the guns from your home to the murder weapon. Unfortunately, the bad news is that the only people caught on O'Brien's surveillance cameras in the past week were O'Brien and Mrs. Campbell. The details of the case hit the media, and they turned our lives into a living hell. Reporters hounded us outside our home when we weren't there and even outside my office. Some of the questions made me look like a clueless cuckold. They asked if I knew about her affair with O'Brien, and so on. I guess I was a clueless cuckold. Once, I snapped back at the reporters, saying that I had never even met O'Brien and had no knowledge of any relationship between him and my wife. I certainly would never have allowed it if I had known. I kicked Elise out of our bedroom, and now she slept in the guest room and used the guest bathroom. She told me that Walker said we needed to appear as a united couple to avoid further damaging public opinion, which might affect potential jurors. Get lost, Elise. Now that your boyfriend's dead, you want to be a united couple? Where was this united attitude when you ditched me to sleep with that scumbag? You know, after hearing Walker lay out the prosecution's evidence, I'm convinced you did it. You're not just a sneaky cheater, you're a cold-blooded killer. I'm glad the state's keeping my firearms until this case is over. I don't trust you as far as I can throw your pathetic ass. I even installed a bolt on my bedroom door so you can't get to me while I'm sleeping." She looked at me with a shocked expression, at least that she was good at. The district attorney met with Walker and Elise several times, trying to negotiate a plea deal. They settled on a deal for manslaughter with a 2-year sentence, of which she would serve 1 year before becoming eligible for parole. Why such a lenient sentence? I guess the prosecution had major issues with proving up motive. Why would Elise need to kill O'Brien? He seemed to treat her well and gave her nice gifts. He even opened a secret bank account where he transferred money to her. When I found out about her secret account, I insisted she pay me back the $50,000 I had put up for her bail. They also had the issue of never being able to find the murder weapon, despite all their efforts. Though Elise maintained her innocence, Walker begged her to take the deal since all the evidence, except for the motive and murder weapon, was against her. And the plea deal was quite favorable. Why risk a jury convicting her of murder? The jury wasn't going to be sympathetic to a woman who had a 6-month affair, and the cameras clearly showed that only she and O'Brien were in the house. With tears in her eyes, she finally agreed. A week later, the judge approved the plea deal, ordering Elise to report to the women's prison in 2 weeks. As we left the courtroom, I handed her my divorce papers. Nothing feels better than hitting a cheater when she's down. The day before she was due to report to prison, Elise asked if I could sit down and talk with her. She disgusted me, and I really didn't want to speak with her, so I told her I'd talk if she agreed to sign the divorce papers afterward. She agreed, and I arranged for my lawyer to come to our house at 7 p.m. with a notary. The divorce was a standard 50-50 split, except she didn't get any share of my business, or any spousal support or maintenance, as it's called in Texas. The joint assets also included the $250,000 in her secret account, gifted to her by O'Brien. I didn't care that it was dirty money. It worked just like any other money and helped ensure she didn't cling to my assets. My lawyer and his notary will be here in an hour. After that, you'll agree to sign the papers, right? Yes, I'll sign the papers. Thank you for talking to me. I wanted to tell you that I'm really sorry for ever getting involved with Conrad. I was in a tough spot, and you were working a lot. We met at a cafe, and he charmed me. He made me feel better at a time when I was feeling miserable. But that's no excuse. I knew who he was, and I knew he owned the company I worked for. I had also heard rumors that he was a womanizer with a reputation for going after married women. I have to admit, I felt flattered that he pursued me. You're a beautiful woman, and I'd be surprised if he hadn't made a move on you, I said, to which she gave a small, appreciative smile at the compliment. I also wanted you to know that I never stopped loving you, even while I was seeing him. Even though I was sleeping with Conrad, I never truly loved him, and I knew our affair would end sooner or later. It sounds crazy, but I really thought I could have two men, at least for a while. My affair was never about you, and I wanted you to know that we never really talked about you. Early on, after we had finished, he tried to insult you, and I left instead of spending the night with him. I told him that if he ever said anything bad about you again, we were done. It was after that night that he opened the $250,000 account for me. Wow, I said. This sounds straight out of the Cheater's Handbook. Chapter on What to Say When You Get Caught. You know most cheaters get caught eventually, and you knew I would never tolerate infidelity. What exactly did you think would happen when you got caught? I deserve that. I know you have strong morals. Believe it or not, that's one of the things that attracted me to you back in college. I knew you'd throw me out if you ever found out, but I guess every cheater thinks they're different and won't get caught. I think the risk of being caught is part of the thrill that makes the affair exciting. But of course, it wasn't worth it. Maybe I'm a cheater, but you and I both know I'm not a murderer. Tell me, Brian, did you kill Conrad or pay someone to have him killed? Nice try. Elise, Walker put you up to this, did he? Set you up to try to get a confession out of me. Her pale face told me I'd hit the mark. Tell me, dear wife, if I did it, how the hell would I have gotten there? You think Captain Kirk beamed me over in the Starship Enterprise? Face the facts. You saw the surveillance footage. It was just you and that jerk O'Brien at his house when a bullet put a hole in his head. Since we're on the topic, why don't you finally tell me why you did it? Was he going to dump you? Did you tell him you loved him? And he just laughed, saying you were just a good toy for sex. Go to hell, she growled. Thank God, never again, I snapped back. At that moment, the doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of my lawyer and his notary. I think this conversation is over. Time to end this miserable marriage, I said, stepping out of my office to open the door. For once, the lease kept her word and signed the divorce papers. In a few months, I'd be a free man, and my ex would be sitting in a medium-security state prison. I even played the gentleman and drove her to jail. Okay, let's be honest. I wanted to make sure that she was locked up and out of my life for good. 6 months later, I was at Lee's house, celebrating the finalization of my divorce, which had come in the mail earlier that week. We were sitting in his bar, drinking adult beverages, and Lee was smoking a fine cigar. Do you feel even a little guilty? I asked him. Lee gave me a sharp look. That bastard killed my younger sister. He had it coming. Maybe he didn't pull the trigger himself, but he seduced her, a married woman with 2 kids. When her husband found out about the affair and kicked her out, O'Brien dumped her and cut her off. Megan was so devastated that she'd rather take her own life than face the consequences. But we both know O'Brien was to blame. Lee had told me about O'Brien and his sister after her death. He had been heartbroken for weeks. I just nodded in response as Lee paused, taking a deep drag from his cigar. And what about you? Do you feel guilty that Elise went to prison for a crime she didn't commit? Not really. That stupid crap brought it on herself. She knew I'd burn her life to the ground if I ever found out she was cheating, but she did it anyway. And hell, I learned how to fly and land your plane. That was pretty cool. Plus, someone had to stop O'Brien from going after more married women and ruining more marriages. He caused too much damage. Unfortunately, it seems like our courts and legal system don't care about that. Sometimes morality and law just don't line up. You've got that right, brother, Lee said, tipping his long neck beer toward me, and we clinked bottles. We sat in silence for a while, enjoying the evening. Then I asked, "We've never really talked about it, but how tough was the operation for you? How did it feel to put a bullet between that scumbag's eyes?" "Recoil. That's what I felt," Lee said with a laugh. I knew Lee had served in special forces and probably killed plenty of bad guys, but this mission had been particularly tricky. After his sister's death, Lee had planned to kill O'Brien. His military training taught him to plan meticulously, and I had to admit, his plan was brilliant. I had known Lee for a few years, and we were good friends. We often went fishing and hunting together. He thoroughly scouted O'Brien's country house on the hill. Before she died, his sister had even told him that O'Brien always kept the exterior cameras on, but turned off the interior ones when he was home. That bit of information was crucial to his planning. I found out about my wife's affair shortly after it started. O'Brien had sent her a text, an innocent message, likely some code for their affair. Lee's sister, Megan, and Elise were connected through their work at one of O'Brien's companies. When I first told Lee about Elise's affair with O'Brien, it took him some time. But eventually, he convinced me to play the long game and not divorce her right away. While Lee was an experienced killer, I was practically useless in our operation, but we were in this together. Lee decided that my role would be to pilot his plane while he carried out the wet work. It took him several months to teach me how to fly and land his plane. It was fun, but deep down, I knew I was learning to fly just to help Lee kill O'Brien, and that sent a chill down my spine. We tracked Elise's movements using a GPS tracker on her car, and I had learned the passcode to unlock her phone. I often checked her messages to monitor her upcoming meetings with O'Brien. On the morning of the operation, Lee drove an old Jeep to a secluded spot about 2 kilometers from O'Brien's house and covered it with camouflage netting. He removed the plates and replaced them with ones taken from an abandoned car he had found. After hiding the Jeep, I picked him up and dropped him off at his house before returning home before noon. That evening, I went to Lee's, and we flew the plane, just like I told the police, except I was the one flying. Lee was dressed entirely in black, with black leather gloves, a balaclava covering his face, and night vision goggles. He looked terrifying. He had a military-style square black parachute, which he said was very maneuverable and would allow him to land on O'Brien's roof, or even better, on the second-floor balcony with a sliding door leading to an upstairs bedroom. O'Brien's master bedroom was downstairs. He also had a backpack strapped to his front, filled with tools and equipment for his escape. I piloted the small plane under Lee's direction until he felt we were in the perfect spot. Opening the plane door, he shouted, "Let's get this done, buddy," over the noise of the propeller, and jumped into the night sky. The conditions were ideal. Darkness, barely any moonlight, and calm winds, allowing Lee to make a perfect landing on the second-floor balcony. From his recon, he knew the cameras weren't pointed at the balcony. He picked the lock on the balcony door and waited there until O'Brien arrived and turned off the indoor surveillance cameras. Lee quietly entered the house and crept down the stairs. He told me that he wanted to have a conversation with O'Brien before shooting him. By tracking Elise's car with GPS, we knew she was still about an hour away. We didn't think there were any listening devices in the house, but Lee didn't want to take any chances, and in the end, he didn't care what O'Brien had to say. He found a spot where he could watch O'Brien and waited for him to sit down, as he didn't want his target to panic and run outside. Once the bastard sat in his chair, Lee appeared, pointing a gun at O'Brien's head. To say O'Brien was shocked and terrified would be an understatement. At first, Conrad thought he was the victim of a home invasion and quickly offered the masked man money and valuables. With the gun still aimed at O'Brien's head, Lee calmly approached him and whispered in his ear, "This is for Megan." Taking a step back, Lee saw the realization hit O'Brien, and he also noticed a large wet spot forming on O'Brien's pants. Then Lee pulled the trigger, ending O'Brien's pathetic life. Lee's escape gear was a dismantled ultralight hang glider made with lightweight aluminum struts that fit together to support the nylon fabric of the wings. It took him about 10 minutes to assemble the glider. Since the exterior cameras were angled downward to catch intruders, Lee figured he only needed to fly about 100 meters away from the house to avoid detection. After making sure he packed all his gear, he stepped back onto the balcony and locked the door from the outside this time. He climbed from the balcony to the roof and used a rope he had tied to pull the assembled hang glider up onto the roof. Fortunately, the roof's slope was manageable, so he carefully climbed to the highest point with the glider. Feeling a light breeze on his face, he took a running start along the ridge of the roof and launched the glider. He told me he must have been pumped with adrenaline because he probably flew 500 meters before landing. Once on the ground, Lee disassembled the glider and made his way to the Jeep. He packed up his gear and drove off into the night. The next day, he disposed of the gun, the hang glider, and the black clothes he had worn. He even got rid of his shoes to avoid leaving any traces. Hearing Lee recall this part of the mission, I exclaimed, "Lee, you've been retired for over 10 years, but you've still got it." "Brian, I did it for my little sister. May she rest in peace. As Toby Keith once said, I ain't as good as I once was, but I'm as good once as I ever was." Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.